This episode is brought to you by Generate Solutions, your go-to AI experts specializing in empowering commercial real estate companies and environmental consulting firms. As AI is quickly transforming industries and enhancing efficiency, it is important you don't let your business fall behind. At Generate Solutions, we streamline workflows and automate tasks by creating custom AI agents tailored specifically to your business needs. Interested in taking your operations to the next level with AI? Email mfiorante@generatesolutions.com or find us directly on LinkedIn by clicking the link in the bio. On to our episode.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of A Conversation with John Conenna. Today, again, it's going to bring me great pleasure because we're going to talk about the sport that I love, and we're going to talk to the great legendary hockey historian, author, columnist, someone who's covered this since 1976 for the Montreal Gazette, the Montreal Canadiens, NHL.com, you name it. We talk about the legendary Dave Stubbs. We'll talk a little bit about Dave, but what he's doing now. But we're going to get into two gentlemen, of course, one that passed away 4 years ago, the great Tony Esposito, and of course, what happened a couple of weeks ago to the great Ken Dryden. David, how are we doing, and what's going on with you, young man?
John, young man will be the last time I'll be accused of being that, but a delight as always to join you. It's busy. Hockey is ramping up in Montreal. The Canadiens had their golf tournament, their charity golf tournament at the beginning of the week. And there were probably about 40 or 50 media gathered out at the course. RDS, the French language sports channel, went live for 4 hours. I don't think they go 4 hours live in a stretch at the Masters. So It's crazy. The Habs had 20,000 people in the Bell Center for a prospects game. So to say that hockey is not just the game in town, but the only game in town is not to understate the truth. Habs training camp is beginning, and this entire city is excited about the prospects of what the Canadiens will bring in on your end. Certainly in Chicago, a big season with a centennial season for the Blackhawks and the Rangers and the Detroit Red Wings. So we have three of the so-called original six NHL teams all celebrating their centennials this year. Very, very exciting time for hockey for sure.
And to say the least, of course, you continue to be very busy. I follow you very closely on social media. I even saw now this thing coming up with a gentleman that I coached here in Illinois, because I coached hockey here on the amateur level, Ryan McInerney, with the movie about another special friend of yours, the great Glenn Hall, a movie that looks like it's going to be coming out. And I know Ryan personally, and I know you have helped him along with another gentleman that was just on here a week ago, Paul Pascal. What is going on with that before we talk about Esposito and Dryden?
Well, these gentlemen are all great. I mean, Paul Pascal has such an absolutely phenomenal archive of hockey video and film from back into the early days of the game. And anytime I'm working on a special project and need some audio-visual support, I'll call Paul. He's one of my very good friends. I don't get to see him often enough. He's in Toronto, but I do see him at the Hall of Fame. And we've done a couple of NHL trophy case documentaries together, studying some of the legendary trophies in the Hall of Fame's trophy case that go to NHL players. Ryan has been working. It's been a labor of love to bring this film, Mr. Goalie, to life, and he's worked a very long, hard time. Patrick McMahon has done the actual editing of it, and he's done a superb job. I've seen many versions of it as it's been coming to be, and I've seen the final version of it not too long ago. And I have a vested interest. I'm privileged to be on camera and to have been a resource for it. But the work and the research and the number of people who Ryan assembled to tell the story of Mr. Goalie is incredible. So the film is set to debut at the Windsor International Film Festival at the end of October, and Ryan's hope is that it will be widely available after that. He hopes on a streaming service. He hopes that it will appear in other film festivals. He hopes that maybe a sports network will pick it up, but it's an absolutely phenomenal study of Glenn Hall, and very, very privileged to be a part of it, and very excited for the premiere and to have people see this film, because it tells a wonderful story about truly one of the great, great goaltenders of all time and one of the supreme gentlemen of the game ever.
Incredible. Well, I'd like to start this by talking, of course, a special friend of yours, and I was following that for so many years. We're going to talk about the legendary Tony Esposito, of course, who started his career in Montreal and ended up over here by me in Chicago from 1969-70 to 1983-84. Your recollections of Espo after, I know it was the anniversary of his passing 4 years ago. What are some of the things that you remember about Tony and, of course, the special relationship you had with him in Maryland?
You know, one of the great things about the work that I do is that these players, a lot of these players that I've written about, these guys were in my scrapbooks as a kid. They were wallpaper in a boyhood bedroom. You spend time reading about them later on. You start writing about them later on as a journalist. And since I joined the National Hockey League in 2016, a lot of my work has brought me much closer to some of these guys. And Tony O is one of the very dear, special people in my life. I was very, very fortunate to get to know him and Marilyn the way I did, to be invited to their home in Florida, to spend time with them at the NHL 100 Greatest Players Gala out in Los Angeles, to see them at the Hall of Fame, to just be out and about with them. So that was an incredibly special time for me. But Tony was one of these great gentlemen of the game. And, you know, I could not, as I could not with lots of people who were Tony's contemporaries, I could not write their lives as fiction because, I mean, their real lives were better than any kind of fiction that I could possibly write about them. When I spent an evening with Tony and with Bobby Hull and with Denny Savard, who were ambassadors of the Chicago Blackhawks at the time, a few years ago together, spent a night at United Center with them. And Tony went in by the employees' entrance. He was always told, you can come in the front door, you can go in through the luxury suites, you can go in that way. But Tony said, when I come here to go to the suites and to hang out with fans and to sort of go from corporate box to corporate box, it's a work night for me. And he said, I like going in the work entrance. And he would go in, he would have to go through the metal detector, and we laughed about that because, I mean, what apart from, you know, some of Tony's jewelry and his special cufflinks that he had were in the shape of his iconic mask. I mean, he's not setting off metal detectors. He's not one of these guys who has so many pieces of titanium and metal in their body from hip replacements and elbow and knee replacements that he'd ever set things off. But to spend the night with him and just hang out with Tony was great. I mean, I would always just pick up the phone, call him with some anniversary date, and he would always sort of say, okay, what's the date today? And I'd tell him, well, this is the 50th anniversary of that, or the 25th anniversary of that. And he'd always laugh and he'd suggest I needed a life, and I could never argue with him. But some of these facts were always great things to be able to relate with him and to him. There were many times I'd call Tony for a story. We'd just call and to talk and, you know, about some specific thing that I was working on. But later on, it just became much more an idea that, as with lots of these guys, I would just pick up the phone to call just to shoot the breeze and just to talk to them and to hear their stories. And as I say, I would sort of scribble some things down. Sometimes the calls were never for consumption of a story, but what they would always do is give me a little more depth, a little more breadth in terms of the context of these guys, what they did, how they did it, what motivated them, and why their careers and their lives in hockey were so special to them and to all of the fans who loved them so dearly.
Dave, what was the very first time you remember meeting Esposito? Was it with his years in well, he of course was in Canada in the late 60s. Did you meet him as a Chicago Blackhawk or after his career?
Would have been after his career. I would have probably seen Tony at the Montreal Forum, a couple of games probably. I would have been covering a little bit of the Canadiens on a bit of a daily basis at that time. But it would have been much more later on. I think that the Blackhawks came, the Canadiens had a special celebration night, and they had a number of the Blackhawks come in to Montreal. And I spent some time with Tony that night. And, you know, Tony didn't do an awful lot of media. He just wasn't terribly comfortable with it. And I get that. I mean, these guys have done a lot of stuff in their time, and they just, at some point, they just feel that they don't have an awful lot more to contribute. And maybe they're a little bit hesitant, perhaps, about their own recollections, their own memories. And they just never wanted to kind of put themselves in a position where they were uncomfortable or they were missing a date by a significant amount. So Tony didn't do a lot of media. So once he kind of took me a bit under his wing and started to, there was a great confidence. And that's one of the joys of what I do, is working for the league. I mean, these guys understand that I'm not in there to try to dig dirt or to try to find some story that will put them in a tough light, So I'm kind of a member of the family, and I've always enjoyed being in that position the last 10 years. So I think I would have met Tony probably at length for the first time when he came to Montreal for an evening. He and Ken Dryden spent some time together. It's been a tough month. We lost Ken, and it was completely, absolutely by surprise. Ken had battled cancer for 2 years, and not a soul outside of his family knew. Scotty Bowman, who coached him in Montreal to 6 Stanley Cups, did not know, or 5 Cups, I guess. Al McNeil would have been Kenny's first coach for the first cup in 71 against your Blackhawks. I'm sorry.
Yes.
We had, we lost Ken. And the thing that kind of surprised me, or didn't surprise me so much, but it just kind of, I started thinking about it. We lost Tony to pancreatic cancer in August of 2021, and that was very, very private. No one outside of his family knew that he was ill, and he passed in hospital. Ken Dryden, same thing. I spent the better part of a full day almost with Ken in Montreal during the Four Nations face-off this past February, and didn't have any clue at all. And he, at that point, was probably, 6 months or so from his passing. Even in the last month to 6 weeks, I was in contact with him. The last exchange we had, I messaged Ken, and we spoke about the fact that Wayne Thomas had died. And Wayne was one of the goaltenders who played with Ken with the Montreal Voyageurs in the AHL before Kenny made it up to the NHL. And again, at that point, a month out, we didn't have any idea. Serge Savard has an annual big charity golf tournament. He celebrated the 1976 Canada Cup team at a golf club north of Montreal back in August. And Ken was invited. Ken was one of the roster goalies for that, but he was injured. He didn't play. And he replied to Serge. He said, "Thank you for the invitation, but I think that the spotlight should be on the guys who are on that team. I just don't feel comfortable coming." Well, Serge, who played with Ken through that entire run of the Canadiens' glorious 1970s, had no idea that Kenny was ill. And 10 days after we lose Ken, we lose Eddie Jacquemin. And Eddie was 86, Kenny was 78. But, you figure that both Tony O and Ken both died at the age of 78. They were stable mates on the 1972 Summit Series team, and they both went of cancer, and they both went very quietly, virtually off the radar, and we only found out about their passing after it had happened. So the good thing is, at least these guys, when they spent time in the public and they were out in the public eye, they understood how they were adored by fans. They understood the respect that they held. They understood the esteem in which they were held by teammates and opponents. So it's not as though they left this earth without knowing that they were important parts of the lives of many, many, many people. But very melancholic that both Tony O and that Ken were lost to cancer almost invisibly, and we only got a chance to really celebrate their lives after they were gone.
Sure. And thank you for bringing up 1972, because I still see these. For me, the two iconic games are Game 1, where Dryden starts in the Montreal Forum, and we have a 2-0 lead. And then, of course, the Russians come back to pummel us in that game, where we start to realize that, though, we better not take this lightly. And just to end it on the Esposito game, and you could tell me your thoughts, in Game 2, Harry Sinden decides to go with Tony Esposito. After being a Chicago Blackhawk fan from 1969 to his retirement in 84, I still say to this day, the 4-1 win in Toronto was the best game I ever saw Tony Esposito played. He was on a different planet, especially if you watched the first period of the Russian barrage. You thought Scud missiles were coming at Esposito. Do you remember those first 2 games? And since we're talking about Dryden and Esposito.
Well, I do, John. And in fact, Game 1 was, Canada jumps out to a 2-0 lead. And the whole lead up to this was that it wasn't a matter of how badly Canada was going to beat the Russians. It was going to be literally, were they going to score in double figures every game? The one gentleman from Canada who went over to scout the Russians before the series only saw Vladislav Tretiak play 1 game. And I think that was the night after Tretiak's bachelor party. He was lit up, whatever game he was playing in. They came back and said, "This guy's a joke. I mean, forget it. You'll never do. We can just there's no competition here at all." And of course, Tretiak in Montreal stood on and said the conditioning of the Russians in Game One was so evident. Canadians jump out to a 2-0 lead. Canada as a nation was very, very cocky. It was going to be a blowout. It was going to be 8 consecutive wins, but the interesting thing is, in conversation with a number of these gentlemen who are still with us and who played on that 72 series, they say, if that series hadn't evolved the way it had, we would not be talking about this, 53 years later. There would be no discussion about it. It would have been, it was an international series and it was a blowout. But this series became way more than anything about hockey, John. It became very much a political thing. It was two political ideologies facing off against each other. It was all this espionage and Canadians thinking they were being spied upon in Moscow. And it was just a really, really difficult thing. Yvan Cournoyer has two very, very specific memories of his career. And he says losing to the Toronto Maple Leafs in the 1967 Stanley Cup was one, and representing his country in that Summit Series was another one. And it's incredible when you think that Cournoyer won 10 Stanley Cups in his career, and one of any of those 10 Stanley Cups is not among his top two memories. It's the Summit Series, and it's losing the cup to the Leafs in '67. So, yeah, that game in Toronto was huge. I asked Ken about that game after he had been lit up in that 7-3 loss in Game 1. And he said, listen, the fact was that we didn't have a lot of time to sort of gather ourselves up and consider what had happened. He said, we went off to Toronto immediately. And he said the beauty of not having a Sunday morning newspaper in Toronto waiting for them, not having sports radio going around the clock, not having the internet. He said, we just kind of gathered ourselves and licked our wounds and said, we have to play another game 2 nights down the road. Well, Tony O gets the call. And that's the most important game to me in that series. If Canada loses Game 2, then, I mean, it's lights out. I mean, I don't see how Canada would necessarily recover. And the Canadians arrived with having taken the Russians lightly, obviously. This was, at the end of the summer. They were still playing themselves into condition. They were not in shape. The Russians had been playing literally around the calendar, so they were in fabulous shape, obviously. But Team Canada really kind of came together once they left Canada, once they had played Game 4 in Vancouver, and then they went off to Europe and they had a training camp over there. Once they got over there, they became a team. And all of the players to a man will say that it was then that happened. And, you figure that, Phil Esposito said they could have played 100 games and Team Canada was not going to lose again. I mean, whether or not, that's right. But Canada was so strong at the end of that, there was no fear. I mean, going into the third period of Game 8 that they were going to lose that game. And you look at Espo staying out on the ice. I mean, he never should have still been on the ice, but he said, I was not leaving the ice. And he's apologized to his teammates. He said, I probably should have been on the bench and you guys should have taken your spots. But Phil literally put the entire country on his back, and he was the spiritual leader and the greatest player in that series. Paul Henderson scores 3 winning goals in consecutive games in Russia. I mean, phenomenal performance. But Phil literally took all of Canada, put it on his back, and he said, and he's told me many times, I was not going to let my country lose. And that's, how the series wound up playing out. So both Tony and Phil, when we lost Ken, I gave Phil a call, and he said, I never really kind of got along that well with Ken. He said he spoke like a lawyer, and I spoke the way I did. If you've ever spoken with Phil Esposito, you'll know exactly what he means, right? But he said Tony and Ken got together great because when they were together, they never talked about goaltending, and that's why those guys clicked. So, two phenomenal goalies who, just go to the Hall of Fame, and they were the anchors on that team. But no one who, was not sort of around during that time would ever sort of have a sense of how important that was. And Canada literally had a nervous breakdown after game one. I mean, the country just could not believe it. We woke up the next morning, it's as though our worst nightmare. And then you wake up and did this really happen? Well, yes, in fact, it did. So, the Summit Series was incredible, and both Ken and Tony did what they had to do when they had to do it, and it was a tremendous series. Still, absolutely one for the books. It can never happen again, based on the geopolitical world and where we are with the NHL today, and how NHL dressing rooms are United Nations. This was an NHL All-Star team against the best players in Russia at the time. And these guys played 8 games of knock 'em down, drag 'em out hockey, and it was absolutely phenomenal.
I have to say, David, and thank you for breaking it down the way you did. I still remember Esposito with that when he made the statement in Vancouver. We're trying. He couldn't believe how they were being booed, and he was off the ice. But I remember him saying, he was asked, "Are you proud of your 2 Stanley Cups?" when he was with Boston, the 70 team and the 72 team? He says, "No, it's that series that Dave Stubbs is talking about to my audience here today." And he says, "This was a war. This was a war, like you said, it was of the political nature." You beat me to a question that I wanted to ask you, because I look at Ken Dryden and Tony Esposito, and of course Dryden had that phenomenal run in the 70s, and of course upsetting the Blackhawks in 71. Of your recollections, did Esposito and Dryden get along? Because their battles were like heavyweight boxers when they went up against each other. Of course, Dryden getting the better end of Tony in the sense of maybe the better teams in front of him. But did they get along? Did you recollections of both men?
Oh, they did, absolutely. And when they got together in Montreal the night that the Canadians had a celebration at that, I guess, as I say, that so-called original. So I keep saying so-called original 6. I know between 42 and 67 in the NHL, there were 6 teams, but, the 6 teams that played during that 25 years were not, of course, the original 6 teams in the NHL. But that's original 6 is a nice basket in which to carry those teams. Those guys, they got along famously, and they respected each other. The thing about goaltenders is that a goalie's not playing against a goalie. I mean, it's not the same as if you're a forward against a defenseman, or you're supposed to check someone, or you're going to ride someone into the boards or something. So Marty Brodeur would often speak to me about that. I'd say, "Well, how do you feel about playing against so-and-so?" He says, "I'm not playing against him. I'm playing against the team. My job is to stop the puck, but what the guy does 180 feet down the ice is no bearing on me. If the guy makes a great save, I might sort of almost kind of nod to myself and say, wow, that was a terrific save." But it's not a goalie against a goalie. So there's a very different dynamic there. But these 2 guys got along really well. Ken was on a different plane altogether. Yvan Cournoyer roomed with Kenny 1 game in Boston in Ken's first season. And Yvan said on the ice and in the dressing room, he was a hockey player, but he'd show up, carrying law books on the road. I mean, he'd be sitting there. The rest of all of us are going out to go for a beer or go for dinner. And Kenny's sitting in his room, crushing law books and going through statutes and carrying an encyclopedia with them. So he was a very different guy in that way. But no, they got along very, very well. And that was one of the things that I've always enjoyed when goaltenders from that era get together. You never got the sense that they were opponents, even if they were playing on different teams. These guys are lodge brothers. And that was an expression that Jerry Cheevers has used a lot. These guys were lodge brothers, and they pretty much were brethren. They were part of the same crazy family, and they played their idiosyncrasies and their weirdness and their the oddball tendencies to the max. And they were regarded as such. That players left them alone. They let these guys do what they did. But when you think about it, there were no goaltending coaches in those days. How is a coach going to talk to a goalie and say, "I expect you to do this or that"? I mean, Tony talked to me about that, about, Sam Pollock and coaches in Montreal. He says, "How can this guy tell me how to play goal? He wouldn't know a goalie pad from a cricket pad." So the goalies were left on their own. They were left to their own devices, and they learned to do what they had to do by themselves. And by God, they did a wonderful job given what they had and the rotten equipment they played with. And then the likes of Bobby Hull and Stan Mikita bending sticks into bananas and taking their heads off or threatening the lives of fans 40 rows above the glass. So these guys were just on a very different level altogether. And that's
altogether.
one of the great things about watching the goalies from that generation get together and just hear them and just watch them talk and compare stories and tell their war stories. Fascinating stuff. Thing about goalies, John, they're like a catcher in baseball, right? All the action's happening in front of them. So they have a very different view. And I think that's why you see so many goaltenders succeed in the broadcast booth, because they just have a different analytical sense of the game of hockey. They just see
Sure.
it in a different way. And that's why so many of them, people like Darren Pang, Tony did some broadcast work. Ken was Al Michaels' partner in the broadcast booth for 3 Olympic Winter Games. So these are guys who just had a different sense, a different view of the game. But Tony and Ken, to your question, yeah, they got along famously, and
Wow.
they were very, very respectful of each other and the teams, and they had a great time when the occasion was that they could get together off the ice.
I'm going to ask you for some final thoughts on Tony, and then we'll go to a little bit more about Ken. Final thoughts about Tony. Were you surprised, or were you ever, or did you ever ask Espo why a book wasn't written about him? I know he, like you said, he was this kind of conservative type of man. And after that, I'd like to just know your final thoughts of what you thought of number 35 here in Chicago.
Yeah, well, I have behind me, I'm not sure if you can see, just over this shoulder, there is a Chicago Blackhawks lunch pail. And that
I
was a
see it.
premium that was at United Center. And Marilyn Esposito sent that to me. And I kidded Tony. I said, when I die, I'm going to be cremated and have my remains put in that Chicago Blackhawks lunch pail and buried. And in Montreal, I would be disowned for life. But that's a very treasured little thing. And there's also a Tony O bobblehead sort of right beside
Yes.
that over my shoulder. So I asked Tony about that, and he just kind of figured, look, I don't have enough to say. And I'd always sort of say, you're crazy. I mean, the career, like you grow up in Sault Ste. Marie with your brother, and you played hockey together outdoors. You skated down the street, I mean, to go and play hockey. And then you come to Montreal, you come out of the Houston Apollos, and, you have a degree. You go to school. I mean, that's not a traditional path in those days. You're going from junior hockey into the NHL or through the AHL, through the minor pros. I mean, Tony, got a degree and, went to school and studied and was ready to do something with that if hockey didn't pan out. So
Sure.
he just felt there've been a couple books written about the Espositos. There's the
Yes.
Brothers Esposito was written. That's in my library. And there's Phil did a book called Thunder and Lightning. And there have been a few other things that have been done. But Tony just never felt that, there was anything there. So Bob Verdi in Chicago and I would talk with him all the time. And he was wonderful with us. And there was no shortage of Tony Esposito stories. I probably have written a book about him without the stories being between 2 covers.
Right.
But he was one of the very, very special men in my life. And when I got the call that he had passed, it was a very difficult time, John, because when you're writing an appreciation for someone who has become a good friend, it's tough to draw that line between being a professional journalist and someone who's appreciating a friend and what he meant to you. So there have been too many of those guys who I've had to write these things about. But part of what I do is that, and I take it very seriously that I want to spend as much time celebrating these men while they are with us, and then remembering them and talking about their legacy, and maybe educating some fans who might not know too much about them with some of the words that I write after they have left us.
Sure. Very well put about about Esposito. Dave, I really, because I always wanted to talk to you about this. Like I says, following you and I remember some of the things you put out about Tony, and you're still putting out about Tony. Of course, 2 weeks ago we lose the great Ken Dryden. Here's a gentleman, like you said, on the different spectrum, the author, the lawyer, the teacher at universities in Canada, the analyst, you name it, a president of the Toronto Maple Leafs. I mean, it looks like this man had an appetite for life. I was mentioning this to Paul Patskow. How in the eyes of a Dave Stubbs will Ken Dryden be remembered besides hockey? What is your now final thing as the dust is settling on these last 2 weeks of this major surprise?
Well, John, in this country, it's not so much how Ken Dryden will be remembered as a hockey player. It will be how he is remembered for all of the other things he did beyond hockey. Just as an example, yesterday in the House of Commons in Canada, parliamentarians from all five parties stood and over a half an hour paid tribute to Ken Dryden, including beginning the Prime Minister of Canada, the Speaker of the House of Commons, Francis Scarpaleggia, started, and he concluded things. These guys were all relating stories about what Ken meant. Ken's funeral was a very private event in Toronto. When he passed on the Friday morning, his wife Linda communicated the news to Serge Savard and to Scotty Bowman. Both of them were stunned; they had no idea, and it
Nice.
was almost as though Linda Dryden didn't want the news to kind of get out. And I think Serge sort of said, well, this is Ken Dryden. This is a national icon. I mean, well beyond the game of hockey. So that's why it took some time from Ken's passing on Friday morning until the time the Canadians released the news on social media at midnight Eastern time on the Saturday morning. They wanted to make sure that they had everything pretty much ready for what everyone knew was going to be this
Sure.
incredible outpouring. Ken was never going to be contained. I've said this many times. He was never going to be contained by a 200 by 85-foot hockey rink, or on the international ice, 200 by 100 feet. Ken's life, hockey was important to him, John, but it was not going to define him.
Right.
He retired with many years of good goaltending left in him, but he knew in 1979, as he concludes his career with his fourth consecutive Stanley Cup, 4 of 6, he knew that he had other things to do. I mean, he's a lawyer, he's an educator, he's a television producer, he's an analyst, he's an essayist. I mean, my gosh, Ken
Sure.
did pretty
Unbelievable.
much everything. He's elected to Canadian Parliament. He serves there. He's a cabinet minister in Canadian government. So he did many, many, many things. I mean, right to the very end. When I saw Ken the last time at length was in February of this past year. It was when the NHL Alumni Association was celebrating the 72 Summit Series as their Keith Magnuson Man of the Year is the award. Ken and I spent a good amount of time that day, and I sort of said, so you're going to the game between Canada and the U.S. tomorrow. And, of course, that was the gong show, right, with 3 fights in the first 9 seconds. And I said, are you just going to watch the game? And Ken just looked at me and said, no, I'm here for a reason. And so, Ken, he would always just sort of have a little something that you were wondering about. And, of course, what his reason was he wrote an absolutely spectacular piece in The Atlantic later that month about Canada and the United States and hockey, and how the U.S. program had grown, and how, so many American players are wonderful athletes at this point in the NHL and beyond. So it was a tremendous piece. So, Ken always had something to say. And while he didn't talk an awful lot, unless it was something that was truly special to him, when he did speak at an event, I mean, people would really listen to him because he really had something to say. And when Canada was in hockey crisis after Nagano, and there was a commission held, I mean, how Canada doesn't win the Olympic gold and all these different things over the years, it's like if we needed a voice, if we needed someone to put into perspective what hockey meant in this country and maybe a little bit of the path that had to be followed to improve it, Ken Dryden's voice was always there. And it was a very special thing. He kind of understood that. And we all understood it, but anytime
Sure.
Ken had something to say, we would sort of sit up and take notice, because this was a man who had a very different vision of the game and understood much more than this was just hockey. This is part of the Canadian fabric, and it was very important. And the game is very important to Canadians. It's been a lot of years since we've seen the Stanley Cup won by a team up here. 93 is the last time. But, Ken would always sort of he'd be able to cut through all of the chaff to get to the kernels of wheat. And that's the thing that was very important about what Ken Dryden did.
And again, like the books that he wrote, he did things just in a fashion that, like you just said, he wanted it to be done right. It was just something perfect, the way he played the position, the way he taught at a university author, just incredible things. Well, I truly wanted to take a look back with you on these two special gentlemen that in my time I grew up with, one disliking him, of course, Mr. Dryden, but then respecting him later on in life for all the things that he's done. And of course, the idol, Tony Esposito of my childhood, everybody in Chicago that put on a set of pads or put on some street hockey things before they went on the ice. Everybody in Chicago wanted it to be Tony Esposito when you were 9, 10 years old. I'm going to ask you a question before I let you go. I normally ask 5 questions.
Absolutely.
But the question I would like to ask you today is,
Okay.
your career has been unbelievable. I mean, for me to have interviewed you, and this is the second time you've been on my show, I truly am grateful for this. Yourself and a gentleman like Paul Pascal is just over the rainbow for me. But I have to ask you, your work is phenomenal. I follow it. I see a post, the information from goaltenders like Glenn Hall to Roger Crozier, players, anything, pieces that you've done on Guy Lafleur, Beliveau, just incredible. The question is this, Dave Stubbs, if you had to do this all over again in your life, if you came back and you had to do it, is Dave Stubbs doing it the same way that he incredibly does?
I think so, John. I don't think there's too much that I would change the way I have done things. I've been very, very privileged to be in a lot of really great places. I mean, my career has been about much more than hockey. 12 Olympic Games. I've covered the Masters. I've covered Formula One racing. I've done lots and lots of different things, but hockey has always been in my DNA. I mean, I learned my love of the game on my dad's knee, reading the summaries and the game stories in the Montreal Gazette and the Montreal Star. To have been able to take my love of the game, and any Canadian who has hockey in their blood, to be able to take that love and sort of transport it into my livelihood has been an absolute privilege. To be able to pick up the phone and call David Keon or Jerry Cheevers or Ken when he was with us. Guy Lafleur was very, very close to
Oh,
me. Montreal, by the way, just named a bridge to Ile Bizarre, which is a community just north of the city, for Guy Lafleur yesterday when we're talking here and laughing, sort of saying that bridge is always choked with traffic. So this may be the first time that Guy Lafleur's name will ever be used in vain by Montrealers. It's just one of these. I can't imagine having done anything that I would have enjoyed more. I've spoken in schools and kids will say like, how hard is the work? And you sort of say, well, if you're really enjoying what you're doing, it really isn't work. I mean, there are long days, and there are many days that break your heart when you're writing obituaries and appreciations of some of the Tony O's and the Ken Drydens and the Guy Lafleurs and Jean Beliveau and Maurice Richard, Gordie Howe. It's just been way too many of those. But
right.
I've been privileged to get to know these gentlemen and to have been a little piece of their life and to be able to tell a little bit about their lives and their careers and sort of how they were
Sure.
motivated and what the special memories were for them. To be a fly on the wall with these guys has been an absolute dream. So it's been just a complete and utter pleasure from start till it'll be 50 years that I've been in this business come January.
To tell you, with 50 years, you've done an incredible job, phenomenal work. And again, I truly appreciate you coming on this morning on a conversation with John Conenna. I've reached out to you a few times. I know you have a busy schedule, but to take these 30, 40 minutes of your time this morning to talk about these two legends. And thank you for bringing up the great Ed Jacquemin, another original six goalie. And there was nothing like Ed Jacquemin and Gilles Villemure in New York in those early 70s, just incredible goaltenders. Dave Stubbs, I truly thank you for this morning and really hope we can do another one down the road.
John, I'm sorry it's taken so long for our orbits to intersect here, but thank you for having me. It was a pleasure the first time, a pleasure today. Call on me anytime. Love to get together and chat. I love your passion for the game and the work you do. So thanks for having me today.
Thank you very much. We have visited today with Dave Stubbs. This will go out on YouTube and Spotify, and probably in about 2 days. We have visited with the legendary hockey historian, columnist, author, a real treasure to Canada, Dave Stubbs. Good day, everyone.